The lady has foolishly attempted to join the conversation with a wild and dangerous opinion of her own.
Here's to the ladies, the fair and the weak. Fair they are, we'll all admit, but who dares call them weak? Our modern girls play as hard and with as much vitality and stamina as any man.
The Christian F Word.
A Christian podcast for everyone else. Hi everyone, I'm Sarah and I'm a Christian feminist.
And hi, I am David and I don't like labels.
Today you're listening to the Christian F Word, episode 2, which is titled Men Too, Feminism and Its Purpose for Christian Men. So I'm going to start off with a short prayer today. Today's prayer is titled Prayer of Protection by James Freeman. The light of God surrounds me, the love of God enfolds me, the power of God protects me, the presence of God watches over me. Wherever I am, God is.
Amen.
So today we're going to be talking about the Me Too movement. And for those of you who don't know what the Me Too movement is, it's a popular social media hashtag called Me Too, or in the church oftentimes it's referred to as Church Too movement. And the movement itself started off with the basic idea to recognize abuse, mainly marketed towards women, whether it's sexual abuse, physical abuse, domestic abuse, and it's to raise awareness for that abuse in all people, not specifically for women, but it is targeted more towards women than men. So, like in any movement, this movement both has its pros and cons. There's definitely a great recognition of victims in this movement that has transitioned into the church and has allowed a really great dialogue in the church setting for things like sexual abuse, things like gender inequality that all runs through our church that a lot of times we feel like we can't discuss as the church. So, in the egalitarian movement, which is the Christian notion that all people are equal. So, in the egalitarian movement, there's always been a discussion, more so in, say, complementarian churches, where there is a discussion for victims, for gender justice, things like that. But I've noticed in this movement that there has always been a lack of a male voice in egalitarianism, and now in this Me Too movement. There are men who suffer from these same things who seem to not really have a voice in the Me Too movement as much as women. So just because we focus on a lack of women does not mean we need to return the favor and lack a male voice. Men are just as harmed by complementarianism and violence as women. However, they feel like they're less able to talk about this as women because of the society and the gender roles that are placed on men, where they have to kind of maintain this tough guy kind of role. And so we should see equal representation from all people, especially for a movement that seeks the equality of all people, not just men and or women, but it is men and women. So all genders, all races, all classes, all peoples should feel like they are equally able to come forward in the egalitarian movement. So recently I wrote an article with Christians for Biblical Equality International, and the article is titled How Egalitarian Theology Sets Men Free Too. And this article was targeted towards my experiences as a pastor and as a Christian in the egalitarian theology, seeing how men are kind of left out of church in the idea of how they're treated. So we think a lot of times that this idea of women not being allowed in ministry, women not being allowed as leaders, or these gender roles, we feel like a lot of times that they really affect women more than men. However, that's not the case, because men are equally chained to these gender roles as women. Where women aren't allowed to participate in roles of leadership, men are often forced into these roles with these masculine and tough guy characteristics that if they don't possess those characteristics, they're often not really equal with the other men in the church. I know I've experienced this with my father, who, if some of you know my testimony, you know that my mother was paralyzed and in a wheelchair when I was 7 years old. So my dad kind of took over the role of mom and dad. So he was taking care of his wife, he was taking care of me and my sister, he was taking care of the house, doing the cooking, the cleaning, all of that stuff. So he didn't have a 9-to-5 job or these traditional father role. And when we started going to church, this really looked badly on him because he was looked at as someone who wasn't manly, someone who wasn't a real guy. He was often told, why don't you get out and go, get a job and support your family better, all of these things where he wasn't included as much because he didn't look like the traditional church gender rolled male. And I've heard so many stories of people in my pastoral career as a student at a theology school, all these different things. I've heard so many men crying out saying that they want something different for men in the church. A professor in particular, I remember so vividly his story about how he says that he loves children, and he loves when he can volunteer in the nursery and children's church. And a particular church he went to for a while, their belief was that men are not to be trusted around children. So because of that, he was not allowed to volunteer with children. A man could not be in the nursery or children's church without a woman present. And as a woman, I know how that would frustrate me if I were not allowed to go somewhere without a man. I know how that would make me feel. So equally, why are we returning the favor and thinking that it's okay, anybody, for a specific gender, a specific race, or a specific person to not be trusted just based on their gender or their race? That kind of goes against everything that the egalitarian theology is against. And so I think it's something that we should consider when we're considering equality for all people. So right now I'm going to let David share his experience because he has more firsthand experience than I do. So go ahead and tell them your testimony, David.
Well, when I was married to my ex-wife, I dealt with a lot of physical and mental, verbal abuse that all came about because I wasn't the type of man that she thought I should be. I would always hear the term, "You need to be a real man. You need to be more like this, or more like that. Whatever it is to be a real man." And as we separated, and I started going through my divorce, and I started going to this church, they would pretty much make me feel like it was my fault that I was abused, my fault that she had multiple affairs, and it was my fault because I didn't lead the way that a man should lead.
Which is exactly how the church treats a lot of victims, both men and women, where the victims are at fault. Whether it's a woman who is sexually abused, it's her fault for being too tempting, or as a man, it was your fault because you weren't masculine enough to prevent it.
Correct. And they would oftentimes throw up the verse that you should love your wife as Christ loves the church, and that if I did not accept her back or try to win her back in some sort of fashion, that it was my fault because I wasn't loving her as Christ loves me. Or they would use the story of Hosea they love to throw that up at my face, that I'm not being the man of God as Hosea was. And so it's just, I got a lot of backlash from multiple ministers or people in the church saying that it is my fault because I wasn't the man of God that I should have been. I wasn't strong and fearless or whatever a man should be.
So after hearing that story and that testimony, how did it make you feel going for spiritual counsel and advice from someone, and going to that, expressing all these feelings, these experiences of abuse and being a victim? How did it make you feel when they kind of turned it around on you and made you feel as if it was your fault, that you weren't tough enough to handle it, that you weren't manly enough because, men can't be pushed around by women? How did that make you feel, and how did it affect your relationship with God?
Well, I pretty much got to the point of feeling hopeless. I would actually pray at night and cry, saying, "God, why did you make me this way? Why couldn't you make me more manlier? Why couldn't you have given me more of a masculine personality?" I just couldn't understand. It kind of made me feel like maybe I was actually a mistake. Like I was actually one of God's first mistakes, or I just couldn't understand how come I couldn't be what I was told I was supposed to be.
Yeah, and I hear that so often with both men and women who are held by these strict gender roles in church, how these ideas, these societal ideas of what a man should be or a woman should be, when being held by that, especially in a church setting, it brings that point of, God, why am I at this point, and you feel like a mistake, because I know that I've been there in that same place in a different context, where in pursuing leadership in the church, feeling and knowing God vividly called me, like I heard the voice of God. And then people around me were telling me, Sarah, if you choose to do this, you will be forfeiting your salvation, because you will go to hell if you try as a woman to be in any form of authority. And so making that choice of, am I going to follow God? And is God really calling me? Or, did God make a mistake? Am I a mistake? Is my calling a mistake? Is my walk in faith a mistake? And many people feel that way, whether it's in situations of abuse or situations where they're just held based on their gender or their race or social class, age, anything. When people are held back and told that it's their fault for something that isn't scriptural at all, first of all. But when they're told that it's their fault, when they're suffering or going through a trial or something like that, it's devastating, not just to the person and their spirituality, but their relationship with God as well. So moving on to our scripture verses today, we're going to read two different stories in the Bible, both of which you've probably heard before if you've been in the Christian setting for any extended period of time. And the common theme between these two, even though they're not linked together very often, the common underlying theme of these passages is sexual abuse and sexual violence. So we're going to be in Genesis 39, starting in verse 6. We're in the story of Joseph right now, and this particular story is about Joseph and Potiphar's wife.
He left all that he owned under Joseph's authority. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. After some time, his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." But he refused. "Look," he said to his master's wife, "with me here my master does not concern himself with anything in his house, and he has put all that he owns under my authority. No one in this house is greater than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do this immense evil, and how could I sin against God?" Although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her. Now one day he went into the house to do his work, and none of the household servants were there. She grabbed him by his garment and said, "Sleep with me." But leaving his garment in her hand, he escaped and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment with her and had run outside, she called her household servant. "Look," she said to them, "my husband brought a Hebrew man to make fools of us. He came to me so he could sleep with me, and I screamed as loud as I could."
So in that passage, a lot of times Joseph is presented as a victor. He is a hero in the Bible, and even though he's gone through a lot of suffering, he's always overcome. But the thing that interests me the most about this story is that Joseph is never looked at as a victim of sexual abuse or sexual assault. However, he has continually sexually harassed in a workplace setting where his master's wife continually tries to make advances on him to the point of ripping all of his clothes off. And Joseph continues to deny these and say no, 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 and no. However, it keeps continually progressing to where he's accused of raping her. So to me, it's interesting to see the contrast between a man and a woman, and how it's treated. Oftentimes in society, if we were maybe to reverse the roles, where if Joseph was a female and there was a male who was pursuing her, it would easily be seen as sexual abuse. However, because Joseph is a male, it's almost assumed as if he has more authority, he has more power, that he has, he's not necessarily a victim in this case. However, whenever somebody says no, we understand that that still means no, regardless of your gender, regardless of who you are. So the idea of the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, it's often looked at as more of an affair as opposed to sexual violence or sexual abuse. However, if we consider what the definition of sexual harassment is, what the definition of sexual abuse is, we look and we can see Joseph as more of a victim in this situation, where Joseph was a victim of sexual harassment, especially in the workplace setting. If that were in modern times, Joseph would be sexually harassed by his master's wife. So it's interesting to see how he's portrayed in the church, and it's almost humorous to think in most churches, if that were presented, would it be laughable to consider Joseph a victim? Because I'm going to be honest with you, in my experience, I would assume most men especially would say, why did Joseph say no? He had a great opportunity. It was a great opportunity for him to do something, but, God would have gotten upset if he chose to join her in that, and that, he had to say no. It wasn't as if Joseph was a victim. It was more of, he's a conqueror in that situation because he had enough strength to say no. However, he shouldn't have had to say no in the first place, because he shouldn't have been treated that way. In the same respect, nobody should be treated that way, forced into a position where they feel as if they are being objectified. So, again, I want to kind of throw it back to David. If you were in that situation, how do you think that the church would treat you if, you have this woman who is pursuing you continually and putting off your advances? In my mind, in my experience, I've seen men looked at positively, like, oh man, you're such a lady killer that you have all these women who are flocking to you. You're a really great guy for saying no. However, in a female perspective, you're looked at as someone who's, well, you're too promiscuous. You should cover up more. You shouldn't be leading other people on. And so there's these two gender-based stereotypes that both men and women in the church have to function through, which is so difficult, because I've been in the position of, hey, you need to change what you're wearing. You need to cover up. You need to do this. So I'm just, asking from your perspective, how do you think that the church kind of plays that out towards men?
Well, I actually had somebody that one time kind of harassed me while I was in a church setting, and I know that when I was alone trying to talk to her, tell her that I wasn't interested, first of all, I was looked at pretty badly because I was alone with a female. So that already was kind of like, well, what are you doing alone with a female? Obviously you're planning something. But then once I expressed what was going on, then I was looked at as, good job for overcoming. But now in the workplace, when it's a completely different setting, because when you have females that are wanting to be with you or something like that, and I would say no, and I turn them down or something, I would be called a homosexual. They would say to David, oh, that's gay. Why would you turn down, something that beautiful, and I would be put down for turning down any woman that looked attractive to the eye. So it's kind of different on both ends.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And in the church, there is this bias towards men in that situation where I've been, where, if you're a single, woman in the church, it's looked at, oh, well, you need a husband. And if you're a single man, it's looked at as, well, what's wrong with him that he doesn't have a wife, and it's kind of looked at in both ways. What's wrong with her? She doesn't have a husband. What's wrong with him? He doesn't have a wife, and especially for people who choose to be single, because for quite some time, even through college, I didn't date. I was focused on my relationship with God, and I was looked at as, well, are you gay? Or, is there something wrong with you? Why aren't you dating around? And so that's a different conversation for another story, but it does tie into this idea of, sexuality and this whole gender-based stereotype that impedes people, especially victims, from feeling as if they have a place within the church.
Well, as you've heard this, that a woman's salvation comes through her husband, and that is actually talked about a lot in the church, how obviously you can't be a true woman of God and have true salvation if you aren't married to a godly man.
Exactly. And there are verses like that also, the verses that that are about, women are saved through childbearing. So what happens to a woman who, is unable to have children? So there are all these things that are really taken out of context scripturally, which we'll go into again at other times. So the second Bible story for today is the story of David and Bathsheba. So we all probably have heard this story, and I'm just going to read a couple verses to give you the context of this, because David and Bathsheba is always presented as a harlot, as an adulterous woman, someone who had an affair on her husband. But I want to read the scriptures about the story. It's in 2 Samuel 11, so you can read the entire story. I'm just going to focus on verses 2 through 4, which say, One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. So these verses don't say anything about Bathsheba's willingness to participate in this. It's often represented as, David and her start, kind of getting along, and then the two of them sleep together, and that's it. However, it's more likely, especially with the culture surrounding it, Bathsheba did not have a choice, and she was forced into it, because when the king of Israel requests something of you, if you say no, you would be put to death. That was just how things went. So, this is a great sin against David throughout Scripture, that he has to kind of redeem himself because it angers God. Not just the fact that he essentially forces this woman to sleep with him, but that he ends up getting her pregnant and killing her husband for it, and all of these issues that really, are kind of a big speed bump in David's life and what he's done spiritually. So, going back to Bathsheba and viewing her differently, whenever I've heard a sermon preached on David and Bathsheba and David's sin, Bathsheba is always thrown in there as the adulterous woman. She is always looked at as not a victim, but as somebody who willingly did something, either whether it was for self-gain, power, or she was just convinced or tricked into it. But I've never really heard somebody preach on Bathsheba as a victim of abuse or sexual assault or anything like that. She's always been, to me, represented as someone who, knew what she was doing. What about you, David, in your experience?
Yeah, well, I've actually watched a few movies that surrounded the whole David and Bathsheba thing, and I've noticed that it's always put down as she was consented, to doing something like that. And I never ever thought of it this way. And after really, noticing the culture behind, this time of Israel, and really thinking about it and noticing that there's nothing in the Bible that implies that she even consented, is actually eye-opening.
Exactly. And so the reason why we had pulled both of those stories, both with Joseph and his experience with Potiphar's wife, and Bathsheba and her experience with David, both of these individuals are victims. The scripture, first of all, shows vividly that Joseph was a victim, and Bathsheba, it never specifies anywhere that she was willing and consented to having relations with David. So that makes her a victim. So these two stories, we have victims, but it shows the bias in our church, the gender inequality in our church, and the issues with this Church 2 movement, and how the church really needs to learn how to focus and acknowledge victims, acknowledge sexual abuse, acknowledge sexual assault in the church, and be able to have that discussion. Because with both of these Bible stories, there is a lack of representation that is proper to share that experience, to understand that experience, and that experience of being sexually harassed, being sexually abused. There's so much going on in our churches with this today. I know story after story after story of, people in the church experiencing sexual abuse, sexual assault within the church. And it essentially being played off as, well, if you're a woman, it was because, you were too promiscuous looking, you didn't dress properly, you didn't act properly, and you were asking for it. But with men, it's this idea of, well, of course, because, he's a strong, handsome guy, of course he's gonna, have women going after him, or all of these different things, and both in the idea of both sexual harassment, but also physical abuse and domestic violence. These all play in with one another and tie into, I believe, directly the idea that the church has this separation between men and women, and they're forced into these gender roles that don't allow for anything other than the normal. So if there is abuse, it's likely your fault because you didn't do something properly, because the church would rather it be about you being wrong than point the finger within and think, okay, what are we doing structurally wrong in our church and in our society that's making us look at victims as if they're at fault. And in almost any case that I've experienced as a pastor, whether it be male or female, they're always at fault. the church or people in the church blame them for being victims of something. They've done it, either an action, deed, something has caused it to be their fault. When in reality, when you are a victim of something, it is never your fault, whether it be sexual abuse, domestic violence, anything like that. It is not your fault. And so for the church to continually perpetrate victims as guilty, it continues this vicious cycle of people in the church not knowing where to go, not just with their relationship with the church, but their relationship with God as well. So I believe that this kind of brings us to a point where we really need to discuss ways that the church can address, the Me Too or the Church Too movement, not just for women, but for men too, about all of these different things that we've discussed, because victims are both men and women. So how do we as a church come together and understand that this idea of complementarianism or this idea of gender roles is affecting and hurting both men in our church and women in our church? Even down to things like how men and women dress, how women, you're supposed to cover up. Men, I've been in a youth pastor. I've been, in youth group as a child. And I remember in my youth group, the girls, whether you wore a 2-piece or a 1-piece bathing suit, you always had to wear a t-shirt with sleeves over your bathing suit. However, the boys were allowed to just wear their bathing suit trunks. They didn't have to wear a t-shirt or anything. They could go shirtless. And so I've always wondered, why are we teaching young girls that they need to cover their bodies up, but young boys should be proud of their bodies? And I've also been in that same situation where, say, if a young man doesn't want to, go without a shirt, they want to cover themselves up, they're looked at as, well, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you showing your chest off? Is there something wrong with you? And so just even in the treatment of both men and women and boys and girls, even just in how they dress in the church, can perpetrate abuse in and of itself. Because when you tell girls your bodies are the reason why boys abuse you, and you tell boys your bodies are the reason why women are attracted to you, and of course they're going to want you because you don't have your shirt on, you're allowed to have that. You're perpetrating this violence that continues over and over again, and it's never really addressed from a different perspective.
I agree. There's been times whenever at my job, say if a pretty female walked by that happened to, be dressed in the way that she felt comfortable, and if a coworker was like, "Hey man, look at her, you see how gorgeous she is," and I say, "Yeah, she's pretty and all, but I'm not really interested in looking," they would say, "Oh my gosh, what's wrong with you? Are you gay, or how come you?" I said, "Well, and I would explain, yeah, I appreciate the beauty, but that's not my taste. Especially if I'm committed to someone that I love, I'm not interested in lusting or looking around, and at the same time, I think it's degrading to sit there and lust over a woman, just because she's comfortable in what she dresses."
Exactly. So with all of this, and I know we covered a lot of different things, and trying to stay on topic with this idea of the Me Too movement, or Church Too movement, I think a question for everyone would kind of be, how can we start appropriately handling victims in our church? And I know that's such a big question that's been discussed in so many different ways recently, but how do we properly address this, where we give victims credit for what they've been through and help them overcome that, not just from a physiological standpoint, but from a spiritual standpoint as well, because so often, because the church lacks that place for victims, whether they're male or female, there's a lack of a place for victims to fit in, whether they've experienced sexual abuse, sexual assault, domestic abuse, human trafficking, all of these different things, whether they've experienced it, there's a lack of them, a place for them in the church where they can feel as if they fit in, where they can process that, and where they can heal from it spiritually. And as Christians, we should believe that spiritual healing is something, only Christ can truly heal 100%. And there are even some scars with different abuses and violences that are, lifelong scars. So the only healing, only healing for that, if we're real about our faith, is Christ. And so if we're trying to separate victims from the church, how are they ever supposed to come to Christ and truly heal 100% from this if we don't allow them to heal spiritually? And spiritually, eventually we have to start healing ourselves before we can try to heal others. So we have to really take a look within the church and understand, what are we doing wrong as the church? And it's not just pastors' responsibilities or, my responsibility, it's everybody's responsibility to try to come together and figure out, okay, maybe our church leadership isn't doing it right, but I still have a part to play too. And even if people aren't willing to listen to me, what can I do and where can I start in trying to begin the healing process for the entire church? How do I address victims? How do I approach victims and say, it's okay. It's not your fault, and what can I do to help? We actually heard a sermon on Sunday that was so good, and the pastor talked about we need to stop praying with our mouths and start praying with our feet. So I think for victims of abuse and this Me Too and Church Too movement, I think that the answer for us is, how do we stop saying things with our mouth and start doing as the body of Christ for these victims?
I agree.
So as always, we encourage you to look it up for yourself, study, send us your thoughts, your feedback. You can go to our website at thechristianfword.com. You can email us at tcfw@thirdwaychurch.com. And you can go to our church website, thirdwaychurch.com. And we'd love to hear any questions, comments, concerns you may have. And we appreciate you for listening.